right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. We are currently waiting for John Vervaeke to show up, unless John is here somewhere hidden in the Stoa. I don't think I see him. We can play another song and wait a little bit more, or we can keep the wisdom-hungry attendees at the Stoa today occupied and entertained. Greg, Zach, any thoughts on how you'd like to proceed?
Since we have an hour, maybe we should just get rolling. I don't know. We'll see. If,
I agree. Has anyone texted?
I did. I shot him a note.
Yeah.
But
cool. So that being said, just muted myself. Let's jump right in. So yeah, today we have our friends Zak Stein and Double G, Gregg Henriques, and hopefully John Vervaeke. And John, Zach, and Greg had a 6-part Dialogos conversation posted on John's channel called Towards a Metapsychology That Is True to Transformation. And in the blurb of that series is they're working towards generating a metapsychology that integrates the multiple domains of psychology, as well as integrating psychology with cognitive science and philosophy in order to properly and deeply account for the human capacity for transformation. So today's session, as Zach mentioned, will be 60 minutes, and it's designed to be a live Q&A for those who watch the series. So we're going to get to questions right away. So start putting in your questions in the chat now, and I'll call on you. We won't get to all the questions, and we probably won't get to them in the order that they arrive in the chat. And I'll probably warm up Greg and Zach with a question of my own. And I guess the question is just a summarizing question. Not everyone here today or might be watching the video watched all 6 parts of the series. So maybe a really high level summary of the series, maybe some of the themes that were mentioned, and perhaps any kind of takeaways that either of you had, any shifts of your thinking that you think would be worthy to mention today.
Yeah, I'll just first thing I say, it was a great journey, and I kind of I was on a walk listening to Zach on Rebel Wisdom right after I came off for a conversation with John. I was like, hey, I got to get these 2 guys together. So for me, it was a really interesting opportunity to intersect developmental thinking, clinical psych, cognitive science, and a broad sort of meta-philosophical psychological viewpoint. I don't think there's been nearly enough dialogos and general conversation about the complexities associated with what is transformation, what are we trying to grow towards, grow to goodness, etc., in therapy and education, in development, and the concepts of transformation. And so I thought doing it with John and Zach would be super rewarding. It was. I learned a lot during the session. I could say more than that, but that's just a sort of a summary that can provide an overview. I'll turn it over to Zach.
Yeah, it was a blast, actually. I, of course, my early career was as a developmental psychologist, and then I went into education and philosophy and other things. And so it had been a long time since I had just straight talked Piaget, and that was a lot of fun to geek out with psychologists. Greg's a psychologist. And so that was a blast. And yeah, the basic thing centered around this kind of what's actually a paradox of transformation. And it's a paradox because some psychological models don't allow for transformation in the way they set their conceptual apparatus up. It's really hard to explain how you turn from a baby into an adult, given that the psychological processes that occupy the model are static, don't make room for development and qualitative change. And so we looked at that problem saying, like, if we can't explain transformation, then probably the models are wrong, in which case we need to work at a metapsychological level to reconfigure psychology to be able to explain the facts, the facts are that we transform. In fact, the whole universe transforms in patterns that can be recognized. So it was great. It was very deep. We went from Skinner to Aurobindo, and like operant conditioning to enlightenment. So it was a lot of fun.
And everything in between there, brother.
Awesome. And for those watching on the YouTube right now, I'll put all the links for the 6-part series in the event description. And we have a bunch of questions coming in now. So we'll start with Evan McMullen to give us the Evan question. Evan, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, so A little framing here. I guess I'm curious about what the historical precursors might be to metapsychology that would meet the sort of needs that I think you guys are working towards. So my question is, to what extent do you think that a metapsychology that is true to transformation will, in its psychological as opposed to cognitive scientific aspects, resemble something like, say, Gurdjieff's Fourth Way, or Tantra a la Nyingma Vajrayana, or Kashmiri Shaivism? Those are the sort of historical precursors I have in mind to get your takes on as to whether or not these are fruitful veins to mine for a transformational metapsychology.
Interesting question. Do you want to go, Greg, or should I take it?
Feel free. I was going to ask about psychology versus cognitive science, but go ahead.
Yeah, I will speak to the listing of what were high-end religious theologies and metaphysics as being related to the transformations needed in metapsychology, that the precedents wouldn't be from the 1890s and the 1900s in the European world, that the precedents would actually come from traditions that were deep in the sciences of the interior, which we got to when we talked about Aurobindo. And so I think that is a really interesting intuition, because as we scoped out at the end of the series, we're looking for a psychological way of thinking that, to use Wilber's language, that transcends but includes Western psychology and the insights of many of these traditions that you're pointing to. Now, I think there are limitations of those traditions as well. And so we can speak to that. But, I always look to James Mark Baldwin if I have to look for one that is like where he actually tried it. And then Wilber's work, I think, is actually a really good move in the right direction. As Gregg's model transforms to include the Aurobindic elements, so there's many families of similar models. But the historical precedents, I do think, are best conceived as religious rather than scientific. And that's a strange way to say it. But if we're right and the old paradigm's dying and a new paradigm's emerging, and I've said this before and I'm just parroting Wilber, where he says, listen, in pre-modernity, God was everywhere. Mm-hmm. In modernity, God was nowhere. Mm-hmm. In whatever actually comes next, and that includes after post-modernity, God is everywhere again, right? Now, what does that mean? I'm not exactly sure, but I know that the psychological theorizing we do has to account for that very deep transformation, the deep structural kind of like worlding level, that the divine and the sacred are re-entering the vernacular, basically.
One question I had with you, Evan, is that I found the wording particularly interesting in terms of psychological as opposed to cognitive scientific. And I'd just be curious if you could just tease out what you had in mind in relationship to that distinction.
Yeah, so it basically comes from the fact that I'm an etymology nerd. And so I take psychologically quite literally as suke logia, right? Yep. So sayings or words about the soul, right? Yep. And cognitive science. So with that, I'm taking up what Zach was saying about there being traditions, non-Western mainly, which have a strong orientation towards speaking true words about the soul. On the other hand, cognitive science, well, the science word implies an investigation of similar sincerity and power, but focusing on the outside, objective, sort of third person frame of the external world. And so to me, cognitive science is looking at the mind from the outside in a third person manner, and psychology is looking at the mind in a first person manner. And so that's the sort of essence Beautiful. Of the distinction I was pointing to.
Great. So I really appreciate you highlighting that distinction. One of the things I would say is in American psychology in particular, for first into functionalism and then into behaviorism, you could argue, at least as it was institutionalized, it actually became very much third-person behavioral as it got institutionalized in relationship to the science. Certainly the UTOC structure, Unified Theory of Knowledge structure, is very much about creating a vision of natural science into objective psychology and or sort of a objective cognitive behavioral neuroscience at the level of, say, animal behavior, into understanding human mental behavior through an embodied 4E cognitive science and acting perspective into socio-cultural justificatory narratives, and then connecting that into what maybe you're referring to as psyche or the felt sense of being in our subjective world. And fundamentally, for me, one of the most exciting at the architectural level is metapsychology that actually affords a conciliant coherence in relationship to the subjective, objective, natural science, and the transcendent wisdom. And what I saw emerge, and especially as I sort of started to really resonate with Aurobindo's work and Zach's guidance and John's guidance with the way you talk is sort of evolving, there was a conciliant coherent architecture around that frame. And to me, if we have that, that does create at least a potential for a metapsychology that's up to the human transformational potentials.
Thanks, I love it.
I'd like to answer Evan's question too, if that's okay.
Of course. Welcome, John.
I apologize for being late. I was at a meeting that was supposed to end at 2, and like many meetings, it didn't do what it's promised to do. So I apologize for being late. No disrespect was intended at all. As you can see, I'm at my office, and they're building a battleship apparently outside my office. So I apologize also for that noise. I take what Evan is saying, and it's good to talk to you again, Evan. So I think of one of the first logoi about the Suke from Heraclitus. You know, you can't find the bounds of the Suke because its logos always transcends itself. And so for me, and of course, this is Heraclitus is, of course, famous for this. Transformation is at the core of his ontology. That idea of transformation is an idea that should not be talked about from either one of the two perspectives that have been mentioned exclusively. If we don't talk about it from the inside, then we're not facing that feature of the Suke directly. We have to see from the inside the inherently transformational, aspirational nature of the Suke. However, to pretend that that is the sole story of transformation, I think is also a mistake, because you have to understand transformation also and aspiration also with respect to the relationship to the world. What kind of world is there for that Suke such that it can transcend itself without, disconnecting itself radically from that world? And that's an important question that in real sense has to be also answered from the outside, because you have to talk about what's outside the organism, what's outside the Suke. And this is what, both Zach and Gregg, I think, make central to their work, insofar as I understand it, which is that ontology is, a proper part of this project. That there is no good sense of giving an account of human being without a complementary and supporting account of being itself. And those have to be woven together. And so I think if we're trying to do with transformation and really understanding transformation, we have to have both the inside view and the outside view, and they have to be properly coordinated. And I see a lot of what we were trying to do in the series is come up with a conceptual vocabulary, a theoretical grammar for exactly that. You can, in many of and I think many of the fruitful exchanges, you can see us moving in and out, in and out, in and out with each other between the subjective and the objective. And what we're trying to convey and say is that is something that a metapsychology should properly do. So that's how I would want to address that. Insofar as we are trying to be very true to transformation, we are stepping out of the typical scientific mode, which says you don't have to do transformation in order to get truth. We think you have to exemplify transformation in the process of scientifically talking about it. And that's what we're trying to do in the very practice of the metapsychology. And so it's very much not just, it as a practice is not just from the outside or just from the inside. It's dialogical, it's transjective. That's why I was so glad we were able to actually do the series as we did it in a dialogical manner, because that is like very proper to the very point, the material we're trying to convey. Beautiful.
Awesome.
Thanks.
You.
I love all that. Thank you so much.
Brandon, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Cool. Love the series, love all your works. I guess to most simply put this, if we acknowledge a sort of developmental and stages can be maybe the wrong word, however you want to think about it, a layeredness, a distinction of different, whether you want to use value memes, worldviews, what have you. If we acknowledge that that is a reality, how does this affect the development of the religion that's not a religion and its ecology of practices? It would seem to me that this would have to be sort of a series of different ecologies of practices to speak to people where they're at developmentally. And so rather than thinking of a particular, this religion that's not a religion, maybe it's a stacked set of ecologies. And I just wanted to ask about what your thoughts were about linking the developmental framework with the development of the religion that's not a religion. Thanks.
So perhaps it's appropriate if I go first on that, because that's sort of associated with me. First of all, I think that all religions, when they're healthy, and religions can get sick, just like other ecologies and other individuals. But when the religions are healthy, I think they properly do stack just like that. I mean, think about a classic Christian education. Sunday school is very different from seminary, and you teach different ecologies of practices at different stages. And so one of the things I've been trying to do, especially the work I'm doing with Guy Senstock and Christopher Mastropietro, is the idea of a pedagogical program where you take people through a series of ecologies of practices where each stage, if you want to put it that way, scaffolds the next stage. And sort of the ultimate goal of this is, how can we take people from the street in adversarial zero-sum game where they're throwing their monologues at each other, almost like spears, into a process I call dialogos, where they can access collective intelligence within distributed cognition and perhaps transform it into collective wisdom that they find calls them beyond themselves, both individually and collectively, which I take to be the core of what we're trying to get, that sense of connectedness and self-transcendence and self-reflection. That's what we're trying to get with the religion that's not a religion. So I think building aspiration and a pedagogical program into the religion that's not a religion is absolutely essential to the project. It's absolutely essential to the project, and so much so that I have made it, a central thing that I'm working on right now. We ran a proof of concept workshop with about 100 people with Guy Senstock, where we took people through over a weekend. And I'm not saying that it should always be a weekend. This was a proof of concept workshop. But we started people with a meditative practice. We took them into a contemplative practice, and then we took them into some core circling. Then we took them into philosophical fellowship, and then we took them into dialectic to dialogos. And the idea was to align them in that way, so you could move people through this kind of scaffolding process, and you could get them doing a kind of reciprocal opening within a stacked ecology, precisely to address the issue you raised. And so, I mean, we got overwhelmingly positive feedback from that. That's not evidence of any completed thesis or anything ridiculous like that, but it's good empirical evidence for the viability of this as a project. And so I'm encouraged by those results.
Yeah, if I could say a couple things here. I mean, I liked what John was saying about the illness of a religion being detectable sometimes in terms of how it handles the intergenerational transmission, right? Like, I would actually make an argument, I don't know if it's true or not, that religion was invented for the kids, right? That like the reason we invented religion was to assure the process of intergenerational transmission was successful, right? Because what does religion handle? Death, sleep, dreams, unexplained events, all the stuff that would make the kids be like, whoa, 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 you guys don't know what's going on, mom and dad. You can't control this. You don't know what's going on. So there's a need to bring into the fold of the social field the younger generations and to assure that the values and knowledge and other things are transmitted. And if you think about the history of humanity, the main container in which intergenerational transmission took place was religious. Like modernity is like a blip on the vast history of humanity that accomplished what I call education through religion. And so this is a kind of like a point that should be noted by the people who are trying to create new religions, especially around psychedelics, right? So they get this all the time, like, oh, it'll be like DMT and ayahuasca, and that's like the future of religion. I'm like, well, who's looking after the kids when you guys are tripping like that, right? And at what age do they begin to participate in these, right? I'm not saying there's not a place for them, but I'm saying it's not center stage, right? What's center stage is the next generation specifically, and the obligation of intergenerational transmission. So there's something deep about understanding the obligations adults have to children, and that requires understanding whatever you want to call them, levels of development, right? Because if you do away with that, well, the kids know as much as we do, then I'm not responsible as an adult anymore. We're all in the same playing field. So there's an exculpating, which means to remove oneself from culpability with regards to intergenerational transmission when you get the levels at, right? So it's actually very important to understand that there are very important qualitative differences between adults and children, and religious discourses have long been sensitive to those. But many of the religious discourses participated in by adults now are not. And so we leave the kids in a kind of nihilistic limbo as we explore our state experiences, and we don't have a way to translate them down into a holistic container for every age that people need to be. That's what religions were able to do. So it's that's a little bit on that track. So it's very important, I think, what you're saying. And that notion that, yeah, religion is only as good as its capacity to assure intergenerational transmission is worth thinking about.
I just want to riff on that before Gregg speaks, because I think that's a very important point that Zach just made. In fact, Zach's linking of religio to cultural ratcheting to education, I think, is like a really, 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 two more times, really, really important idea. What I would say that entails is also a modification of our epistemological norms, because you can't have a mono-level understanding of truth if you're going to try to convey a religion at different stages of development. Now, the danger is to fall into a true for me or true for the person, and that subjectivism is also pernicious and prevalent in our society, and that also will ultimately undermine the intergenerational transfer that Zach talks about. So we have to get between those in how we think about truth. How could you convey? I'll use a Christian model, not because I'm a Christian, just because it has the greatest chance of resonating with the greatest number of people here, just because of historical background. How could you convey the incarnation to a 5-year-old and to a philosopher and them both be true? That's a question that requires a more complex understanding of truth. And you see people from Heidegger on really, really pursuing this than we typically wield in a lot of our scientific and social discourse. So I just wanted to bring that out as an important implication of what Zach is saying. It's a really important question. How could you say the incarnation to both the philosopher and the 5-year-old such that they're both true, but they are also developmentally appropriate? That's to me a very, very important and challenging question.
Yeah, I'll just offer a really couple of quick statements. So one thing is on the current state of affairs. I was just talking to Robert Coble, who did the Conscious Evolution series, and he was just telling me about his own experience, basically in relationship to, hey, he has sort of a spiritual awakening to be at one with the universe at one level when he's right coming out of college, university, as they say in London, and basically then reflect back on this and said, hey, I got no real education about what this is at all. And I have no world view about how to think about meaning in a particular way. So at one level, folks, let's just think about this at a really basic level, go back to, of course, John, and it's like, what is the fundamental wisdom philosophy that society is affording us? And I think the answer is not that much. And he basically was like, well, I felt like I had the choice between a physicalism, sort of a reductive physicalism versus a traditional theism, and neither one of those made much sense. And to me, what I see is that there's a real opportunity for synthetic wisdom philosophy that goes from a 5-year-old to a philosopher. In fact, I got really weirded into this damn garden thing, but one of the first images that I actually saw was that wouldn't it be unbelievable if we had a preschool that was a garden, right? And the kids would go out and they climb on the tree and they play with the bees and they step on the stones. And then those stones eventually evolved into the questions that you would ask. And eventually you're asking, oh, this stone's the standard theory of elementary particle physics. And inside of this stone are the quarks and leptons that make up the material universe in a particular way. I mean, if you could layer a structure of understanding through an appropriate developmental issue, then the issue of educational legitimacy, the issue of religion as non-religion as transferable, the issue of a holistic philosophy that you can enter into and grow with at the individual and societal level is really possible. And that's what I would hope for.
Awesome. The other Brendan, you had a question.
Yes. All right. So the different value memes, pre-modern, modern, postmodern, etc., have their own dominant psychological algorithms for interpersonal interaction, communication, and social relating. And so this includes, Jonathan Haidt's purity, sanctity, in-group loyalty, authority, respect, harm, care, fairness, reciprocity. These are often incompatible with each other unless we synthesize them in a way that would somehow transcend and include each of them. So how might we integrate them?
I can jump on that just real fast. So certainly if you look through the lens of, you talk in this particular way, one of the things, for instance, that you'll see is in terms of value memes, I see, and Jonathan Haidt's frame would agree with this, sort of, he takes a social intuition approach to morality where we're driven by a particular underlying elephant that has particular values, and then we proceed to rationally and justify what those are. And then he delineates the moral taste that we have through particular perspectives. One of the things that I wish he would do is be a little clearer that there is a lot more of a dialectical opponent process between these various structures. So for example, authority and rank is a particular value, and so is care. Well, if you look at those things as is liberty and is more recent when he adds the freedom taste, if you look at those particular values through what I call the influence matrix, you see that actually rank, cooperation, and freedom are really, they can certainly be thought of as particular kinds of structures that people will invest in. But actually to get along, and I encourage you to do this with your significant others, to get along, it's a dialectical balance of power, love, and freedom in relation. And there are opponent processes that can be engaged in. And then when you exemplify those in the best sort of way, so for example, if I have a particular strength and we put it in a family context of parenting a particular way and can form a particular way of order, and my wife can enable freedom and affiliation in a particular way, we can create an effective balance in relationship to that. And relational value and exploration and the balance of order and chaos can be achieved precisely because these moral tastes can sit in frequency dependent balance. And so one of the things that he lays out, and I think he certainly speaks to this, but there are ways to speak to the reality of these kind of underlying motives in ways that are much more dynamically and effectively oppositional rather than diametrically opposed to one another and competing against one another in a deconstructive way.
Yeah, I would say a few things. One is that we don't want to get too wedded to any theoretical model. And so the value memes model, spiral dynamics model in particular, sometimes I'm like, I wonder if that's actually the best way to frame this at all. So that's like a full stop on your question. It's like, it might not actually be a question because the model you're using to frame the question is a problem. Is that the best way to characterize the individual differences that make discourse difficult now? I'm not sure. Like, so for example, I would think that the best thing we could do would be to decrease the level of ubiquitous psychopathology in the culture, which occurs at all levels in the value meme, whatever, right? So like, is it the case that the value memes are actually logically incompatible? I don't think so. Is it the case that it's impossible to talk to people with different values when both people have low-grade psychopathology, including narcissism, perspective taking differences, and sleep deprivation, and propaganda implanting, right? So like, I'm like, I don't think this is, the problem's not these developmental levels and not the way they're characterized by spiral dynamics, not at all. The problem has to do with the ubiquitous low-grade and sometimes high-grade psychopathology that's now just part of our culture. We're exposed on an everyday basis to coercive technologies, coercing us into believing and acting and speaking in ways which we can't actually really be held responsible for because of the level of undue influence exercised by the technologies. So it's difficult for me to look at things like genetics or race or sex or supposed value memes and say those are the issues, when there's like an elephant in the room, which is that we're all suffering from fragmented attention, depression, narcissism, the amount of psychotropic drugs prescribed by doctors. I don't know how many hundreds of times it went up. Like that's not an exaggeration, especially in the youth during the pandemic lockdown. So this issue of, do we use developmental models to resolve the communication and insanity crisis? I'm not sure. I think it's actually a deeper and simpler issue, which is stop the ubiquitous coercive communication, stop the sensory overwhelm attention capture technologies, improve general well-being, and then we'll see where the state of the conversation is. And in fact, the developmental levels lock in and sync like a healthy family, like a healthy school. It's not, the levels aren't inherently problematic.
I'd like to add to what both Gregg and Zach said. I face a strong analog to this problem that was brought up as a cognitive scientist, that I find the neuroscientist and the machine learning theorist and the psychologist and the linguist and the anthropologist all using different ontologies, different methods, different claims for how evidence is generated, how it's considered, what's considered a bona fide theoretical explanation. They're speaking in some ways different languages. But like Zach said, that fragmentation or specialization, depending if we want to talk about it pejoratively or positively, undermines the reality that all of those different levels of what we call the mind are probably causally interacting and interdependent with each other. The brain level, the information processing level, the behavioral level, the linguistic level, the cultural level, etc. And so one of the tasks in cognitive science is, how do we build bridging language between them? And I find it striking that the way that typically works is very analogous to what Zach just said, and maybe it's an epistemic version of something that he's pointing to existentially. What you do is find shared problems within all of them. So for me, for example, all of these disciplines crash against the problem of relevance realization, and that's why I made it the center of my work. Gregg has pointed out that all of these, the fragmentation within psychology is all based on, and I think his argument is very good, on, what he calls the enlightenment gap. It's running through all of them in a shared problematic. And here's where what I would say to the value meme idea is Putnam's argument. There are no value-free facts, but there are also no fract values. They're completely interdependent. And we talked about this when we talked about the Izzat fallacy. And so it's not just that we have opposing values. When we look that way, all right, we will tend to see only difference. But we also have, those values are bound up with, in a mutually constructive way, with intelligibility. And I put it to you, and this is kind of a Habermas thing, we're not speaking unintelligibly to each other as much as we make it out to be. I can't be angry or hate things that I just are completely incommensurate with me. They're just, I don't notice them. I don't pick them up. It's precisely because there is a lot of assumed shared intelligibility that there is so much conflict. So I put it to you that there are both shared problems and shared background intelligibility that we can make use of as we attempt together to innovate vocabulary from the shared problems and the shared intelligibility that does not try to reduce all of these discourses to its own discourse. I don't try and do that in cognitive science, but tries to get them to talk to each other in a way that is mutually transformative. And I think this is very, very possible. I take it that my interdisciplinary discipline, cognitive science, is good evidence for this actually being the case. Is it easy? No, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm making an argument for the possibility of something. Let me give you a concrete example. Both postmodernism and modernism are locked into a Cartesian framework of all knowledge being ultimately semiotic propositional knowledge. That's a deep problematic that they both share. That's a place to talk about them and talk about that shared intelligibility of fact. Both skews the kinds of values they espouse. This is why values of autonomy are so important in both of them, but they also have different interpretations of what autonomy means. And I could go on and on about this, right? So I think there are real ways of bridging discourses going. And there are real reasons to believe in it. I don't think it's easy. I think it's hard. And I think we have to do the kind of work we're doing here and the kind of work that Gregg and Zach and I did. And I think I would say that these two things, right? We have, I think at the epistemic level, there's a shared problematic, and I think it dovetails with, I don't think it's independent from the shared problematic that Zach was pointing to at the existential level. I think there's a deep reason why we have more psychopathology, and it has to do with some of the epistemic problematic that we all share. So that's how I would answer it.
All right. Matthew, you had a question earlier, if you can ask it.
Yeah, this dovetails in nicely. It was about where you guys see, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. It's about where you guys see mental disorders fitting in that whole framework. I'll just read my question. Where do you see mental disorders and syndromes fitting in with human psychological development? So that could connect with what we were just talking about. Do you think that people who've been given such diagnosis should be held in a different light in terms of, treatment and helping them develop? And if so, what do you see as the differences in how we view and develop within the paradigm of mental disorders? So yeah, just sort of, I guess I ask this because for me, I'm just sort of looking into the whole disorder diagnosis paradigm, and I'm not sure where that fits in with this whole endeavor.
Well, I can certainly, this is a great question. I can certainly speak some to this. The nature of philosophically, what a mental disorder is certainly not resolved. Actually, that's the first concept I turned my attention to conceptually. Before that, I'd really published on the unified theory. I asked the question, well, what are mental disorders? And I argued strongly that we had an emerging conception of what a biological disease was through what's called Jerome Wakefield's harmful dysfunction analysis. And basically, he argued that we could use sort of evolutionary theory to develop functional design of biology. The breakdown and malfunctioning of that biological design, coupled with a social evaluation of harm, afforded us an interesting analysis of biological disease. He then applied that to the idea that that's what a mental disease is, and that we should think about all mental disorders as broken biology plus harm. I took that analysis and said I thought that Jerome Wakefield had generated a very good definition of disease. In other words, what general medical professions treat, although that's a debatable thing. But if we start there, and then I argued that actually mental disorders are fundamentally, there's another whole class of mental disorders that are developmental and adaptational in relationship. And essentially what you can track is the expectation, what you have at the level of mental is the expectation of learning, maturation, and development. So it evolves by design. It is not preset in the same way or at the same level of restriction that biology is. What that means is you get adaptive feedback loop potentials, okay? So that mental disorders are often a function of developmental vicious cycles that are not reducible to broken biology. Right? So ultimately, this is potentially it's a really long and complicated, I mean, that's what's a mental disorder in that regard. To me, what I was trying to do is I was trying to articulate a category of what the broad category of sort of neurotic and internalizing conditions, as opposed to some things like, let's say, severe autism, dementia, clear and obvious cases of psychosis, which can be essentially argued potentially, I think with some justification, as sort of examples of malfunctioning neurobiology, that those are what's manifesting those particular symptoms. However, when individuals come to me with meaning, self-esteem, negative emotion, injury, psychological trauma events, and talk to me about their felt sense of anxiety and uncertainty and concern, I actually see, by and large, the psychobiological architecture functioning exactly as you would expect. Unfortunately, what's happening is individuals are traumatized. They do not have the social, meaning-making, coping adaptational structures that enable them to metabolize that trauma in a particular way that allows them to integrate and grow from it. Instead, what happens is that trauma then is rejected for very understandable reasons, is downregulated, doesn't fit in a particular interpersonal and or meaning-making construct. And then what happens is there's a defensive reaction to that and to associations in relationship to that, which in turn create cognitive and interpersonal reciprocal defensive narrowing, to use some of John's term, okay? And then individuals get worried and concerned and defensive about this threat. It's kind of like a psychological immune system to both the injuries and the associations in relationship to that, okay? So the interpersonal, intrapsychic, and meaning-making contexts are absolutely essential for how injury and negative affect are metabolized. And I want to emphasize that because actually, and then at the level of enactment, at the level of adaptation, at the level of justification for what we think these things are, at the level of how we relate, it is the process by which this develops and unfolds that's absolutely key as to whether it creates a vicious maladaptive cycle that then results in unnecessary suffering because the adjustments to it trap you in dead ends that then create what I call triple negative neurotic loops, which is negative reactions to negative feelings and negative events, which in turn complete the cycle. So what I see is we need to shift and not think about every mental disorder as just broken biology, but fundamentally in the ways in which we talk about suffering, negative affect, in which we talk about the human condition, in which we relate to negative feelings, relate to each other, and the healthy or unhealthy context in which we grow as to whether or not we're being channeled in something that could potentially cultivate optimal well-being or the reverse. And you go to what Zach's talking about, if we live in a sick society where the ideational structures, the relational structures, the contingency structures drive you in a particular way, well, then you're going to get a lot of maladaptive mental disorder-like behavior, not as a function of broken biology, but as a function of learning, development, ideation, etc.
Yeah, I'll say at least one thing here. So the metapsychology that I lay out with the triples, I'm going to run it quickly for those who have been, just to get on the record, because there's a way of thinking about pathology here. So there's development, ensoulment, transcendence. So there could be developmental disorders, personality disorders, and disorders with attention and awareness, right? And then you'll remember in one of them, I talked about another triple, which was disorder, disability, disagreement. Remember that? Which supervened on the natural, the normal, and the normative, right? This is getting fun. So the idea would be that a developmental disability or developmental disorder, or actually learning that stops because you're in an environment that you disagree with, right? Similarly with attention deficit disorder. in schools. There are cases, especially with toxin exposures in childhood and things, where there's a legitimate biological problem with the brain that's causing attention deficit disorder. But a lot of it isn't actually a disorder. It's about a disability where it's an atypical nervous system. It's not a broken nervous system. It's just different than everyone, than normal. It's nothing pathological about it. But in this context, it becomes pathological. We call it a disability. And then if a kid's being asked to do unreasonable things, he may reject it and appear to be unable to pay attention when actually he's disagreeing with the rules you've made and you need to explain yourself better, right? That goes on long enough, becomes a diagnosed obstinate defiant disorder thing when it has nothing to do with a brain base or anything. It has to do with actually the reasoning in the culture not making sense to the kid, right? So that notion of disorder, dysfunction, deep biological cause, as distinct from perfectly fine but unique nervous system, as distinct from completely normative level of disagreement. And the reason this is important is because we're in a situation politically where people we disagree with politically, we want to say are crazy. We want to argue that specifically people, I'm not going to get into it, but right, that these people are crazy, that they're not in control of the way they think, they're deeply pathologized, and therefore what? Right. And my argument is like, no. You can't reduce disagreements down to the level of dysfunctions, because then you start putting political dissidents in psychiatric hospitals. Right?
And done.
Which is what they did in the Soviet Union. So it's very careful. You have to very careful. You have to keep these things distinct. If you start calling people you disagree with, people who don't believe in evolution, right? People who resist the vaccine, people who support Trump, they're crazy. Literally, they all have mental problems. Millions and millions of people cannot be responsible for their choices because they're all pathological, right? They think about that line of reasoning. Like it's scientifically completely invalid. And it's a genocidal grammar, right? To be very careful with the genocidal grammars, which sneak out and into the culture from propaganda. And many of the genocidal grammars include the pathologization of non-pathological behavior. Which is to say, not getting it out of the category of legitimate disagreement and into the category of something wrong with their brain. Something's wrong with the brain. So that's, I think we have to track that and keep that close to heart when we start talking about building models of pathology. They're politically very powerful. The DSM has been captured for decades by the pharmaceutical industry, so that we can't start there. So anyway, there's a lot to say on that.
Both of my friends have said brilliant things about this. Yeah, I want to resonate with both of them. So I mean this only as an analogy, because I don't completely buy into the computational model of mind, but the language is still a little bit helpful here. You want us to distinguish hardware problems from software problems from interface problems. Right, your computer can be malfunctioning because there's a crack in your motherboard or something like that. The computer can be malfunctioning because you have a computer virus that's messing up the software, or the computer can be malfunctioning because it's in a network with other computers and you haven't worked out the interface properly. And if you simply conflate all those together, you know what you're never going to do? Get your computers running well. You're just going to actually probably be making things worse if you conflate all of those together. And so this is my way of saying, yeah, what Zach's pointing to is deeply dangerous. If we do not carefully avoid equivocating between those, we will make, I would argue, based on my analogy and in converging with him, where it's much more likely we're going to make things worse. And if what we're attempting to do is to deal with pathology and reduce suffering, we cannot do something that is most probably going to make things worse. What would be the possible moral justification for that? So I would say, of course, Zach was pointing towards that with the threat of domicide, but sort of genocide. But even short of genocide, like if we are equivocating, we are probably fucking things up, which means we are probably harming rather than helping. And any model of pathology that does that has to be a wrong model of pathology. It has to be. That has to be axiomatic for us. And so I want to say that we have to be very careful about this, and we have to work out how it is, because it's inevitable. I mean, this is an argument I make, the very processes that make us adaptive subject us to self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. You can't separate them. You can't jump over your own shadow. And so how do we work that out in a way that is responsible to that general fact, while addressing the individual differences that we will sometimes call pathological, is also an issue that I worry about we equivocate on. So I want, in addition to the kind of thing Zach was pointing out where there's potential equivocation, I think there's also a kind of ontological equivocation. If you'll allow me two older terms, we equivocate between sin and sickness. And that needs to also be much more properly addressed. And the way you do that is by, you can really only adequately distinguish them. And this goes, I think, to a lot of what Gregg is talking about. If you've got a proper ontology that distinguishes them, and so you have different ways of treating them. You treat sin much differently than you treat sickness. But that doesn't mean that they can't be mutually involved and interpenetrating in an individual. And so in addition to the other equivocations between the hardware, the software, and the interface, I also worry about the equivocation between sickness and sin, if you'll allow me that older language. And I share, you know, Gregg's notion that we trying to alleviate this equivocation by reduction is stupid. And I share Zach's concern that this equivocation is most probably going to make things worse. And so that's what I would add to. I'm really just re-saying, I think, what they said, and just giving a particular spin on it. I just think there's, I'm just trying to extend sort of the moral imperative that came with that distinction.
All right. So we're at almost at the top of the hour, about 4 minutes. Perhaps we can go a round table with our guests, and just maybe any closing thoughts or any kind of questions or lines of inquiry that you'd like to go down after this series is concluded. Perhaps we can go with Zach, because he has to leave at a hard stop at the top of the hour.
Yeah, it was a blast to get these questions. I wish we had more time, and to just speak with John and Gregg is always a pleasure. It's always like exciting. I'm drawn to my best with you guys. So thank you for that. And I'll just say that, you know, where we landed at the end there shows that these metapsychological reflections, which seem to be obscure and ontological and stuff, actually are right at the core of some of the worst things taking place in our culture. These equivocations about deep issues having to do with the nature of our minds and our humanity. So we're up here highfalutin meta theorizing, but it ultimately operationalizes down to how are we perceiving other people? What are the models we've internalized that are psychological meta theories, whether we're meta theorists or not? How are we dealing with ourselves and others, right? So it was nice that it kind of grounded in a serious way. So.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. Heck of a blast. I really do. I saw some great questions. I appreciate everybody's attention. Yeah, for me, I think we're deeply confused about mind, the metaphysics of it. That spreads into everything about love, about meaning, about what we're doing. I think then we get defensive, and then we have to try to protect an ego that feels on top of an empty soul. And then that, you know, gets us into maladaptive craziness. And then we justify that by the other person's being insane. And then it's a very, very precarious situation. And we see, you know, meaning and mental health crisis everywhere. For me, there's really these two levels. And one is, yes, this is kind of an arcane academic issue. You got to get deep into the weeds, at least it's my experience. And there are these, you know, understand the histories of why people made the decisions that they did. Like, why does Watson do what he does? Why does James do what he does? What's happening in relationship to science? You know, we can say, hey, science, psychology is the words in relationship to psyche. That's one good. It also tries to jam it in the context of what the modern empirical natural science structure did. So there's a lot of technicalities that do need to be ironed out. I think there's an opportunity. This is what I was so excited about. I think there's a really emerging opportunity to solve, resolve, fill in some of the gaps of old knowledge and get a coherent, conciliant framework that puts the psychology, cognitive science, social sciences coherently on top of the natural sciences, and then puts them in proper relationship to theology and spirituality. And if we do that, then we can have a scientific humanistic philosophy that does justice then to the everyday lives and the real world concerns that people have. And I felt like the conversation we had, exemplified some of that, both in terms of content and process.
I agree with Zach about how I'm drawn to my best when I talk with Zach and Gregg. And I agree with Gregg that I think we exemplified as much as we stated the solution that we were pursuing in the series. And it was a great pleasure to participate in that. And I really appreciate the questions that were asked here at the STOA. And as always, I'm deeply grateful for Peter and the work he does. My brother, I'm always grateful for everything you do. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That gratitude lands, and sending gratitude right back to the three of you for doing the fine work you're doing. And I'm loving these spontaneous collaborations with the STOA and these conversations that are happening in the hyper conversation. So do check out John, Zach, Gregg's work and upcoming events at the STOA. You can check it out at thestoa.ca. Yeah, I put some 2 interesting ones in the chat that people might like. So that being said, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the STOA today.